So thank you, Josh. And again, welcome to this celebration of and tribute to novelist Toni Morrison. Um, I wanted to say at the beginning that the Institute is a membership organization, little advertisement here, devoted to conducting public programs across the humanities. We've been here for 40 years doing this, so we've got some shelf life and some experiences in it. And I'm very happy to see you all on the screen tonight, and especially those who are first-time Institute visitors and attenders. And I invite you to look us over at www.dallasinstitute.org and see what we have going. Everything is Zoom this semester, so it's easy to join in now, and hoping that you might find something of interest. So Toni Morrison was born in 1931 and died last year on August 5th. And in 1970, she published her first novel, The Bluest Eye, which began a remarkable run of 7 major works between 1970 and 1997, including Song of Solomon, Beloved, Jazz, and Paradise. She also wrote several volumes of cultural commentary and criticism that have become a standard part of the body of that kind of work in America. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 1988 for Beloved, and in 1993 was awarded the Nobel Prize for her body of work. She is best known and most acclaimed for Beloved, the story of a slave woman, Setha, just escaped to Ohio, who kills her baby to keep it from being taken back to slavery, and of the return of the baby girl from the dead, seeking the life it never had. Morrison's stature as a classic writer was undoubted and uncontested at her death. We are here tonight to remember and celebrate this most amazing writer, the likes of whom are rarely seen in the world. We're lucky to have been living during the time when she was living. And shortly, I'll turn the program over to our 4 panelists. To begin, though, and perhaps to create a tone based on Morrison's hopeful vision set within a seemingly hopeless circumstance, I want to read a passage of intense lyrical beauty from Beloved, the moment just after Setha, assisted by the white girl Amy Denver, gives birth to her daughter on the shores of the Ohio River. Here's an excerpt from Beloved. Spores of blue fern, growing in the hollows along the riverbank, float toward the water in silver blue lines, hard to see unless you are in or near them, lying right at the river's edge when the sunshots are low and drained. Often they are mistook for insects, but they are seeds in which the whole generation sleeps confident of a future. And for a moment, it is easy to believe each one has one, will become all of what is contained in the spore, will live out its days as planned. This moment of certainty lasts no longer than that, longer perhaps than the spore itself. On a riverbank in the cool of a summer evening, 2 women struggled over a shower of silvery blue, under a shower of silvery blue. They never expected to see each other again in this world, and at the moment couldn't care less. But there on a summer night, surrounded by blue fern, they did something appropriately and well. A powder roller passing would have sniggered to see 2 throwaway people, 2 lawless outlaws, a slave and a barefoot white woman with unpinned hair, wrapping a 10-minute-old baby in the rags they wore. The water sucked and swallowed itself beneath them. There was nothing to disturb them at their work, so they did it appropriately and well. So now I want to turn to our panelists and introduce all of them very briefly at the beginning, and then each of them in turn will talk to us for several minutes, and after each one have something of a conversation among themselves, and then at the end of that, which will be about 40 minutes, then we'll have a discussion that will involve our audience as well. So let me introduce our panelists tonight. Dr. Sanderia Faye serves on the faculty at Southern Methodist University and is a professional author, speaker, activist, and sommelier. Her debut novel, Mourner's Bench, has won several prestigious prizes, and she is currently working on her second novel, 11. Dr. Amber Dyer holds the PhD in literature from the University of Dallas. She is a Cowan Center and Dallas Institute Cowan Center consultant and faculty member in the Dallas Institute's SUROS Summer Institutes. Dr. Darryl Dickson-Carr is professor and department chair of English at SMU. He teaches 20th century American literature, African American literature, and satire. Ms. Onyema Nweze has been a public school educator for more than 25 years and alumna of the 2006 and 2007 SUROS Summer Institutes. She is a member of the Teachers Alumni Advisory Board of the Cowan Center for Education at the Dallas Institute. And I should mention that Ms. Nweze is going to be teaching a class in the Bluest Eye starting next Wednesday, September the 30th. So those are our panelists, and I wanted to go ahead and begin. And I'm going to go by first names tonight. So Sanderia, would you kick us off here?
Yeah, thank you, Larry. That was a beautiful passage that you read. First, I'd like to also pay my respects to Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and to my friend and author Randall Keenan. And then I want to thank the Institute for giving me the opportunity to pay tribute and celebrate the life of Toni Morrison. And thanks to the panel and all of you for joining us tonight. I met Toni Morrison on February 7th, 1998. Earlier that day, people strolled in and out of bookstores and cafes for the inaugural Northern Arizona Book Festival that included icons like Randall Keenan, Quincy Troupe, our 2020 Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, and others. But the highlight of the evening was the keynote speaker, Toni Morrison, on the campus of Northern Arizona University. Her novel, Paradise, had been published that Christmas, and I struggled through it in hopes that she would sign it. At the time, I was still working in corporate America, but I had applied to the Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at Arizona State University. Paradise was the only book I had read by Morrison, so I can't say that I was a fan. For doing her presentation, she won me over. I was impressed with her extensive vocabulary, but also that her message was accessible to a layperson like me. As her presentation progressed, she stated the prison industrial system was the new form of slavery, which was the first time I had heard anyone say that. Then during the Q&A, a young African-American woman asked whether Ms. Morrison thought she should write about our culture. Morrison paused and answered emphatically, yes. Who would be better to tell our stories than us? And I'm paraphrasing a bit. As far as I was concerned, it had been a perfect day. I had 2 takeaways and a list of misspelled words I plan to look up the definitions to when I return home. Then fortunately, I was invited to the VIP reception. When we arrived, there was a line from the door to the front where Morrison was seated in an oversized chair. As I got closer to her, a handler told me I only had enough time to say my name, that I enjoyed reading Paradise, and to move on. I did exactly as she had said, but Morrison caught my hand and said thank you, and then asked me what I liked about the book. I looked back at the handler because she hadn't instructed me on what to do if Morrison asked me a question. Sometime during Morrison and my exchange, I mentioned that I applied to the MFA program and was awaiting for the decision. She said, "Oh, you'll be accepted." Before I could reply, the handler touched me and I raised up to move on, but Ms. Morrison shot the handler one of those looks that would make you take 2 steps back. One I'd seen my grandmother use when I was in serious trouble. Then Morrison caught my hand again as if to say it wasn't meant for you. Afterward, I didn't bend, but instead I stooped down to her level while wearing 3-inch heels and listened until she released my hand. That night, I decided to become a serious writer, if for no other reason than to sit in a chair and prophesize to up-and-coming authors. So seriously, I'm still working on my vocabulary, but my next novel is about the prison system. From that day forward, I have read and studied Toni Morrison's work. As a writer and scholar, I've learned that Morrison knew the rules, but chose to break them. For example, in her Pulitzer Prize novel, Beloved, where trauma serves as a primary theme, Morrison used narrative distance to show how badly traumatized the characters are, and she creates narrative distance by shifting points of view from largely third-person omniscient to third-person limited, and even first-person, at times within the same paragraph, which is frowned upon in standard literary fiction. The novel opens with the omniscient point of view and the description of 124. The narrator appears to know everything that happens at 124, as if she is narrating the story from above, looking down on the location. Soon, the narrator's camera leaves the distant view and zooms in on baby Suggs. This shift to third-person limited only allows the reader to experience the events from baby Suggs' perspective. Then later in the novel, other characters, Setha, Beloved, and Denver, tell a first-person account of their story. In my opinion, Morrison adopts multiple perspectives to allow the characters to either remember or, quote, re-memory of their trauma. By switching perspectives, Morrison includes the stories of different characters, which allows the readers to witness how difficult it is to articulate the various ways slavery traumatized them. But the most horrific event, school teacher, the white man who comes to retrieve Setha, the only person in the novel who has not been traumatized, tells the story of what Setha did to her baby in first person, which leads me to believe that the women were too traumatized to tell their story, or Setha was too traumatized to tell that story. In Morrison's work, she shows us through narrative distance the effects of collective trauma that slavery has on African Americans. As a writer and scholar, Morrison has always focused the camera on the Black experience. Through her work, she has allowed us to dream, to have empathy for a rapist, and to feel the commonality of the effects of slavery. As an author, she has given me permission to break the rules and not to be confined to the standard craft elements or standard English language. During these current turbulent times, I rely on advice that was given to her, which helped her continue writing when she couldn't and felt paralyzed. And I quote, "This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There's no time for despair, no time for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. This is how civilizations heal," unquote. I celebrate Toni Morrison by writing our stories, being unapologetically Black, breaking the rules, and continuing to read and study her work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanderia, for that. I appreciate it very much. And I want to ask our other panelists, does anybody have a remark or response to what Sanderia has given to us? Anyone?
I do.
Onyema?
I just first want to say thank you for that narrative distance portion of looking at Beloved. I thought that was so compelling. As many times as I've read it and worked on it, I never considered how capable, in a sense, the characters are in expressing feelings and based on that trauma. And so I wonder if you noticed, and forgive me if you mentioned it and I missed it because I was trying to take as many notes as possible, but did you notice that, because you mentioned them, the distance showing whether they were remembering or rememory, which I think Morrison sets up as different ways of coping. Do you notice if she is in first person more when they're in a true memory, or maybe third person when they're doing a rememory, or vice versa? Did you notice any connection there?
She goes in and out so often, mostly third person limited. But I do believe, like in the further chapters, when Denver is finally allowed to speak, as you can see, most of the stories are told in fragments. And so, but in those later chapters, and I wish I had written them down, she's completely in first person when Setha finally tells her complete story in Denver and Beloved. All three of them are allowed to speak in their own voice and in first person. And that's where I see that she's the closest.
Okay. Thank you so much. I enjoyed that.
Question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanderia. And I'll be looking to see in 11 how you break the rules. Did you break the rules in Mourner's Bench?
Except for the vernacular language is mostly where I broke the rules. But also in Mourner's Bench, I did, as far as it's a gumbo of a story. Like it's not just it's just not a one person story. It's a communal story, and in that respect, I did break the rules. I think Morrison writes community better than anyone that I've seen, and so I've tried to pick up from that how she allows the community to speak, and then you can tell exactly who's speaking and how they feel, even though it's in a community of people.
It's really good to know, that Morrison is an influence on you and your writing, and I'll be looking for it as we go into the future. Amber Dyer. Amber, would you go next and tell us a little bit about your experience with Morrison?
I sure will. Yes. Can you hear me? Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today to celebrate Toni Morrison's tremendous achievement and her contribution to American literature and culture. We have taught Toni Morrison for decades now to hundreds of graduate students and teachers at the Dallas Institute's Cowan Center for Education Summer Institutes. And I have been reading Morrison's children's stories like Peanut Butter Fudge and other classics to my own children since they were babies. In fact, my daughter, before she could speak, she knew Toni Morrison's language was good. And I knew it because when I would read Morrison's stories to her, she would just shake her shoulders. There was something so beautiful, even in her children's stories, about her language and rhythmic. In fact, after recently watching the PBS documentary on Morrison as a family, our 11-year-old son and I had a lively conversation about Morrison, race, love, and eventually about matters of 11-year-old boys' hygiene. And my son woke up the next morning and told me that he dreamed that our family went somewhere and everyone on the street kept pointing at him and saying, "Take a shower, and you should shower." But then Toni Morrison showed up in his dream, looked at him straight in the eye, and she said the final word, "Shower." And end scene. Now, I share this funny story because Morrison is recognized universally as a voice with true authority, whether it be learned literary scholars and authors like my colleagues here today, or university students across the nation, Oprah Winfrey, PBS, or little children whose imaginations are electrified by her language and stories. We all recognize Toni Morrison's greatness. And how appropriate For she notes that when she was a young child and started to write with chalk a bad word on the sidewalk, a word whose meaning she did not even know, she discovered from her mother's stern reaction that words have power, that Toni Morrison's words have power. But it seems that there is more to Toni Morrison's power as an artist than her beautiful words. Though through prophetic seeing, Morrison invites her readers into deeper layers of reality through what the Greeks call poesis. As co-founder of the Dallas Institute, Dr. Louise Cowan writes, poesis is a kind of knowing different from philosophy or history, and yet it occupies an irreplaceable position in the quest for wisdom. Coleridge calls the source of poetic inspiration the primary imagination, the repetition in the finite mind of the infinite I am. And the ontological splendor of poetic beauty, as Jacques Maritain describes it, enables one to encounter being itself in the literary arts. As Nietzsche suggests, we experience a great work of art in the way that we experience music, in our deepest interiorities of being. And Nietzsche hadn't even read Toni Morrison's jazz. Yale University professor Amy Hungerford suggests that Morrison is interested in literature instead of sociology because Morrison imagines the novel as a medium that can hold the human within it. The novel allows the voices of the oppressed, the unheard, to speak. Morrison, of course, wrote her master's thesis in part on William Faulkner's treatment of the alienated, and she mentioned the Southern author throughout her life. In Faulkner, Morrison witnessed how to incorporate voices into her novels that could sit by themselves, unmediated by a narrator. And going beyond Faulkner, as only she could, Morrison's characters are unmediated by what she calls the white gaze. She doesn't explain Pecola's anguish in the Bluest Eye. Pecola herself shows us why she thinks blue eyes might give her the privilege of a family like Dick and Jane's. Morrison said in her interview with Nellie McKay, "I want my work to capture the vast imagination of Black people. That is, I want my books to reflect the imaginative combination of the real world, the very practical, shrewd, day-to-day functioning that Black people must do, while at the same time encompass some great supernatural element," end quote. Beloved, one of Morrison's works that we read with graduate students, teachers, and principals at the Dallas Institute, is Morrison's masterpiece of this kind. She wrote this work, of course, based on the true story of the American slave Margaret Garner, who in 1855 murdered her own child rather than allowing that child to be enslaved by her oppressor. As Philip Weinstein writes, the novel explores the resources with which Black persons survived a system they could not escape and would not accept. Morrison conceives in this novel the entire race's long-lost child named Beloved. This character is simultaneously a crazed girl wandering the roads, the protagonist, Setha's daughter, come back from the dead in search of love, but also of revenge, and finally a figure for the untold number of Black people who died during the several centuries of horrific slave traffic between Africa and America. The figure of Beloved is one of Morrison's most magnificent imaginative creations. Weinstein writes, if Beloved's mother, Setha, is to resume her life and turn her own tormented past into purpose, she must escape Beloved's stranglehold. And this painful healing process can only occur in relationship. It cannot occur in isolation. We need one another if we are to heal from trauma. Morrison implies one must somehow dare to come to grips with his or her own past, yet not drown in its recall. Morrison's writing belongs to the great body of works that, as Louise Cowan writes, appeals to the imagination, that faculty of mind which enables the intellect to know things of the senses from the inside. In other words, to experience by empathy things other than ourselves and to make of that experience a new form. For Toni Morrison invites us not just to become better knowers, but to become seers. Through agency of the imagination, through cherishing her characters on their own terms, Morrison is America's Sybil, one of our most inspired poets. I use the word Sibyl, for the Sibyls were the oracles in ancient Greece who prophesied at holy sites with divine inspiration. Heraclitus writes, the Sibyl with her mouth utters things not to be laughed at, unadorned and unperfumed, yet reaches to 1,000 years with her voice by aid of the god. The Sibyl tells Aeneas in Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid that to go to the underworld is fairly easy. Everyone has to do it eventually. But to retrace your steps and return to the upper air, hoc opus, hic labor est. This is work. This is labor. And Morrison is both Sibyl and epic poet, one who dares to go to the underworld, to the darkest regions, and who dares to return to the upper air, retrieving the lost song, uttering with holy breath all of the dimensions of being. In so doing, she honors the dignity of Black persons, suggesting that fierce love can heal, forgive, and transform. Morrison celebrates Black heritage, for as she says, we have come through the worst and we are still here. At the same time, her work transcends any single heritage, for as Cowan writes of the classics, they partake of the fundamental structures of being itself. Indeed, we rank Toni Morrison as an artist of this magnitude, one whose art partakes in the fundamental structures of being. She writes most profoundly about love. And when all things come to pass, isn't love the final measure of all things? As Seba says in Beloved, love is or it ain't. Then love ain't love at all. Toni Morrison, thank you for opening our hearts to love that is.
Thank you, Amber. Comment or remarks for Amber?
Amber, I just wanted to say that first of all, thank you for that presentation, and thank you to Sanderia for yours. I think what's remarkable about both is I like especially the talking about Morrison in the context of Sibyl, because and the underworld and how Morrison really explores that. Obviously, she explores that in Beloved in multiple ways, but one thing that she does that you pointed out is remind us that that you have to work for the things that are truly rewarding, and that is something I think applies to Morrison's works in general. That she makes us work as readers, and that's one of the beauties of her writing is as I think everybody will say consistently, as I will, which is that we've all had to work, but the rewards are completely boundless. So I think that that's something that, I'm glad that you highlighted that.
Thank you.
So wonderful, I agree. Morrison is not easy. She presents work to be done. So let's move along then. And Darryl, could you visit with us next?
Sure, absolutely. And I just want to say good evening, and it's very much a pleasure to speak with all of you tonight and to be part of this excellent panel. It's right and just that we give tributes to this amazing author tonight. It's been a different world since Morrison passed away on Monday, August 5th, 2019, at the age of 88. She was and is a giant in American literary history. She was one of the greatest American authors, a legend that so many of us were fortunate to encounter as she was producing many of the best novels that any of us are likely to read. Her work transformed the way we read and teach literature in colleges, universities, and high schools. And in the last 30 years, she has gone from being included in a relatively limited number of college courses to being ubiquitous. You simply cannot be a respectable scholar of American literature without being familiar with Morrison, even if, for whatever reason, you do not routinely teach her, as many of us do. This status did not come easily. Like most African-American authors, Morrison's work was not taught or taken seriously outside of small academic circles before the early 1980s. African-American literature as a field did not have academic stature. It was risky to build a career on it, much less on African-American women authors that traditional American literature scholars didn't know. It took a constant fight by largely African-American professors and authors to change the state of affairs. This group overlapped with those who helped bring Toni Morrison's novels to the fore. My own encounters and experience with Toni Morrison's work are complex, bridging both the personal and the professional. They don't always come from a methodical, intentional, or untroubled trajectory. In some ways, I came to love Morrison's work accidentally. My story starts with a small bookshelf above my mother, Barbara Carr's home office desk, which is where she paid our family's bills and worked on the business that she started in the 1980s called Black History Comes Alive. My mother's business consisted of her traveling to elementary and middle schools, primarily in local school districts back in California. And with the use of puppets, costumes, and slideshows, she would teach young children and adolescents about slavery, Jim Crow, the modern civil rights movement, and such major figures in African-American history as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Linda Brown, Rosa Parks, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. And she had started these presentations when her own children were young, and it was clear that public schools in the San Francisco Bay Area exposed children to little or no African-American history. But my mother was completely self-trained. She didn't learn about African-American history in any college classrooms. There were no such courses when she started college in the early 1960s, and certainly not at Arizona State, not at most universities. As with Morrison, a lot of what she learned came from books and resources that she encountered by her friends, family members, and interested colleagues. Two of those resources were books that friends suggested to her in the late 1970s, The Autobiography of Malcolm X and Song of Solomon by Morrison. And I didn't quite know what to make of either of these books when I saw them on her shelf. Malcolm, of course, had a reputation in the popular imagination that made him a doppelganger to Dr. King. The edition of Song of Solomon my mother had a cover that celebrated Morrison's National Book Award for the novel, the first major national award that catapulted Morrison into the public eye. I took down each book, thumbed each one curiously, and read not a single word of either one until years later, though I remained intrigued. Morrison finally landed fully in my consciousness in 1988 when I was working a corporate office job while attending the University of California, Santa Barbara. A young African-American marketing agent in the office stopped me one day to ask whether I was going to the Toni Morrison reading that evening on UCSB's campus. I hadn't heard Morrison was coming, though I knew that Beloved had been published and was gathering a great deal of buzz. And not long before that date, it had won the Pulitzer Prize, making Morrison only the third African-American to win the prize for fiction. Ms. Morrison filled 800-seat Campbell Hall, the largest on campus, to overflowing. That evening, she read the last 2 pages of the novel in her sonorous, melodious voice, capped with a standing ovation by the crowd. She then startled us by saying that she would either take questions or sign books, not both. The audience clamored for her to answer questions, much to the disappointment of my acquaintance and many others who clutched copies of Beloved and Morrison's earlier novels, hoping for an autograph and a chance to meet the author one-on-one. What we had, though, was much better. Ms. Morrison proceeded to explain patiently but firmly that she wrote Beloved as a memorial, a tribute to the 60 million people raped, maimed, killed, or enslaved in the Atlantic and African slave trades, their bodies and minds brutalized in unbelievable ways. She spoke of how she wrote the novel perhaps more for herself than for the public. It was a novel that had to be written even if few would ever read or like it. I was enraptured. Though I'd neglected Ms. Morrison's work until that point, I bought a copy of Beloved and read it soon thereafter. But though a dedicated English major, I wasn't quite ready for Morrison's work. Her writing was, as so many readers have learned, rich and dense, which may be another way of saying difficult or challenging. I comprehended only a fraction of what I encountered on the page. It would take a few more years of reading a rich array of African-American history and literature, especially under Elliott Butler Evans, my eventual dissertation director, before Morrison's words would open to me. When Morrison published her next novel, Jazz, in 1992, I showed up to a local bookstore the day it was released, bought the hardcover, which is not easy for a broke grad student, and consumed it over the following weekend. And I eventually incorporated that novel into my dissertation on African-American satire, arguing that Morrison ingeniously parodied a number of American myths and prodded our expectations as readers, pushing us to question our assumptions about characters as we read, placing them into set narratives with specific ends. Morrison's novels are focused almost entirely on African-American characters, African-American history, and African-American experiences in all their complexity, with a particular focus on African-American women's lives. Morrison's characters are highly complex. No one stands out as an unequivocal hero or villain in her works, even if some characters do terrible things. No one is entirely irredeemable. No one is unimpeachable. And everyone has a backstory that makes her or his actions in the present comprehensible, no matter how good or bad. You have to appreciate ambiguity and ambivalence in Morrison. And if you do, you will be rewarded. Her novels also reward rereading as much as or more than such equally celebrated works as Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. The problems I faced in reading Morrison came back to haunt me when I started teaching full time. For every 5 students who loved Morrison immediately and saw how rich her work was, I taught perhaps 3 who struggled with every sentence, every paragraph, every page. But while my classes would always argue over bits and pieces of Morrison's work, one thing remained clear. No one could ignore her work once they encountered it. And from the late 1990s to the early 2000s, Morrison's work, especially Beloved, dominated conferences and panels on African-American literature. Her success helped make possible or extend a resurgent interest in African-American arts and letters in those 2 decades. So dominant was her influence that it took a concerted effort for scholars and readers to pay closer attention to the many other Black authors that were publishing then and their accomplishments. And while this occasionally inspired bitterness and jealousy among certain authors, without Miss Morrison, the extent to which we now pay attention to Black lives and how they matter would hardly be imaginable. The very premise of Beloved, as Morrison explained in a later preface to the novel, was that the bodies and lives of the many millions who endured or died under slavery had effectively been erased from American history. Her work was meant to help set that aright. When she passed last year, I felt it was a loss of a true elder, one who allowed the rest of us to thrive. How many lives have been changed by Miss Morrison's novels? Incalculable. How many courses on American literature have been transformed through reading her work, including her extended lecture and essay, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, which was published in 1992. It's immeasurable. And in most places, it's now unthinkable to teach a course on American literature without Morrison, and certainly no course in African American literature. In 2019, we lost a giant of American literature. Rest in power, Ms. Morrison. Rest in power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darryl. A comment or remark about Darryl's presentation from anyone?
Darryl, you said that your students struggle. Was there any particular portion that they struggle with, or just in general?
There are a couple of places which they struggle. I mean, in Beloved in particular, the section that you were talking about, Sanderia, with the characters speaking in the first person, Denver, Beloved, and Setha. I always reserve one part of my class just to talk about what's going on there, and just to say, everybody, I understand you're all confused by this one section, aren't you? And of course, everybody says they're confused, and so we spend a good 15 minutes just talking about what's happening and have the students just kind of parse that. But a few students, luckily they're rare, at least they're rare at speaking up, will say, some of them just say that they're just aghast in reading Beloved because they're just shocked that anybody would write about such terrible things, and they're not expecting that from in literature. I have a very rare student who says that they don't actually like the way Morrison writes at all, and so those are very rare students. The thing is that students in general, even if they struggle with Morrison, will come forward to say that even if they're struggling, they will help other students figure out the difficult parts. And so that's one thing that is consistently true.
So Darryl, before we go on, your words there at the end about Black Lives Matter reminded me, it took me back to Baby Suggs' incredible sermon in Beloved, and she's talking about the value, right, of the Black body, of the Black experience.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that she says in that sermon is that beyond here, they don't value you and your heart and your mind and your. I'm paraphrasing, but in effect, she's saying that people don't value beyond this level. And the funny thing is, without going into a long discussion of just that passage, is that in the context of that novel. As Baby Suggs, it's a lesson that she's teaching people. You have to learn how to appreciate yourself. It's a very important lesson for Setha, who has not learned truly to love herself until arguably the end of the narrative.
Yeah.
At the same time, as we also hear over and over again, and we just said earlier, you can love yourself too much, and that can actually be self-destructive.
Yeah.
And that's the eternal struggle. You can, too much self-love can kill you and others, and too little self-love can do the same. So finding that balance is one of the terrible struggles of just living, is that you have to find out how much you're going to love yourself, but also how you're going to be selfless and not be selfish.
Yeah. Thank you, Darryl.
Darryl, you mentioned, I just have a question here. You mentioned that she parodies American myths. Is there one particular American myth that's more significant than others, especially that we deal with as a culture?
I would say the whole myth of Southern chivalry. She takes that down in jazz in particular through the character of Golden Gray, who thinks that he is, of course, this Southern gentleman, but of course he's of mixed heritage, and of course he wants to destroy that heritage, which is like, it's the perfect way of bringing up William Faulkner and but also bringing down the same sort of Southern myths that have been really self-destructive to the South in the way and its image of itself, but also just American mythology about these sort of noble ends that Americans see themselves on. So that's probably the chief one that she likes to take down, or at least in that particular novel.
Thank you, Darryl. So Onyema, would you talk to us now to conclude our presentation portion of the program, please?
Okay. All right. Well, I'm really excited to be here. And I feel like I'm in an intimidating position ending this after those wonderful talks, but there's something in each of them that I got, most particularly the last one, Darryl. I appreciate you mentioning how long it took for you to actually embark on Morrison, because I resonate with that. It took me a minute for me to actually get into it and really feel like I was getting something from it. But that being said, I'm say that to preface how I'm going to begin my talk. I was able to approach Morrison and really appreciate her after my time at the Institute. And so I want to begin talking about her narrative genius by mentioning Louise Cowan's descriptions of the genres of comedy and tragedy. According to Cowan, tragedy helps viewers look upon violence and turn away from it freed. It enables them to rise from the devastating experience with a sense of having been fulfilled, and liberates them to shape their lives into the wisdom of comedy. Without the tragic, there could be no comic resolution. Comedy, she writes, takes place in a fallen world moving toward the recapturing of wholeness, pleasure, and love. Its justice is mercy and forgiveness, end quote. For me, staying within the boundaries of either tragedy or comedy, I see Toni Morrison and many of her novels illustrate characters who are confronted by the concept of the other. She acknowledges this exploration and best explains the other in her description of her character, Beloved. Morrison wrote, "For the stranger is not foreign. She is not random, not alien, but remembered. And it is the randomness of the encounter with our already known, although unacknowledged selves that summons a ripple of alarm, that makes us reject the figure, makes us want to own, govern, and administrate the other. We deny her personhood," end quote. Within Morrison's novels, audiences are given front row seats via the language, images, and experiences she creates to speak into a phenomenon she believed needed, and quite frankly, based on the social unrest of today, still needs to be examined and not ignored. To review just a few examples of Morrison's treatment of the other, consider her examination of the process of othering in Beloved. In a novel where school teacher gives lessons that guide his nephews to list the human characteristics and the animal characteristics of the Sweet Home slaves, where those same nephews forcefully steal Setta's milk, beat her for telling Mrs. Garner, and then are punished because a school teacher thinks during the attempted recapture, you just can't mishandle creatures and expect success. And finally, but most significantly, in a novel where a mother who remembers school teachers' measuring string is proud that killing her best thing meant that her best thing would never be subjected to a list of her animal characteristics. In all of this, Morrison clearly illustrates slavery as a universe in which the literally enslaved, being despised and abused others, shines its most revealing light on the enslavers. As Stampede ponders in the novel, white people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle, and the more colored people spent their strength trying to convince them how gentle they were, how human, the more they used themselves up. So it wasn't the jungle blacks brought with them, it was the jungle planted in them. Morrison also examined othering that results from colorism. In her novel Paradise, Morrison illustrates the town of Ruby, a failed attempt at a utopian society comprised not just of blacks, but of dark-skinned, quote-unquote, authentic blacks who separate themselves from the prejudices of the outside world, only to find evil both within their town and within themselves, because in effect, they're othering. In her novel, The Bluest Eye, Morrison presents a young girl who believes that she could be lovable only if she had blue eyes, a yearning exceeded only by the evil fulfillment. I think in Morrison's novels, she shows how image rules the realm of shaping, and sometimes becomes and often contaminates knowledge. Image, according to Morrison, particularly in media, has altered the truth so much that its absence is stronger than its presence. Why should we want to know a stranger when it is easier to estrange another? Why should we close the distance when we can close the gates? Sounds familiar to current events? Morrison should be read because she has challenged and will forever challenge readers to examine the self in the presence of the other. She knew that through her works, she could allow readers to freely glimpse into the violence of othering in a controlled wilderness. They can become the other and examine the self so that lives can in fact be shaped into the wisdom of comedy, as Cowan wrote. As she wrote, succumbing to the perversions of images can blur vision, but resisting them can do the same. Morrison's catalog of works is timeless, and it lets no one off the hook. No matter one's self-identity, a reader who embarks on a Morrison journey can only walk away with a better sense of self, of community, and of humanity.
Thank you, Onyema. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your presentations. Any first comments or remarks for Onyema after her presentation?
I have a question.
Yes.
This is referring to the Bluest Eye, since you're getting ready to teach it.
Yeah.
I was asking, I've been told in my writing career that you can't write a completely evil character. And you would think that the father in this, in the Bluest Eye would be that character. But Morrison allows us to have empathy for him, even by showing his thoughts. So my question is, have you looked at how Morrison did that? Or do you feel that you have empathy for the father?
Ooh, that's hard. It is definitely hard. But I think definitely one of the things that I love about Morrison in general, as I mentioned in my talk, no one is let off the hook. So, and I think Darryl mentioned it a little bit as well in his when he, because I wrote it down because it's so familiar, that there's no standout true heroic figure, that they're flawed characters. They're characters who she gives you background on that allows you to see some have some empathy. And there are some who, I mean, you think of Seta, you can empathize as much as you want to with Seta, but you killed your child. So that is an evil you can't ignore. So again, if I turn back to Kali, in that when you think about his upbringing, when you think about confronting a father who pretty much curses him out and says, "Go away, I don't know you." When you think about how it affected him, that he runs away and just literally defecates on himself. How can you not think that this is going to be someone who's going to be twisted himself as a father? So you have to see that. It doesn't excuse what he does, and it doesn't make him it doesn't make him right, but I think it does make him human. And it's okay to look at somebody like that, a character like that, and be like, I really don't like you. But again, you have to work to close the gap between, that's that self-identification and self-examination, that gap between you and the other. And I think that's how she challenges us to look at these characters and actually kind of close that a little bit in some sort of way. Agree or not, like or not. So I think that's how I would respond to that. It's a hard one, though.
So,
Yeah.
Josh, yes, Amber?
Oh, well, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. I love that. You said it so elegantly. Image rules the realm of shaping. I love that. And as you're describing othering and so elegantly showing us how Toni Morrison refuses to otherize, right? Instead. Another thing I loved about your presentation, your comments, just connecting that to the turmoil, even deeper turmoil since Toni Morrison's death.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of it stems from otherizing. But if image rules the realm of shaping, then there's something so powerful to healing that in story. And I love how you pointed out how she gives us that story. It doesn't mean that we would, agree with what Charlie did, but we understand him, and he's not other. We see him. This passage in Beloved, when the women are a little bit skeptical about giving Seta the help that she needs, but then ultimately the willingness to act and engage and remember, all of that wins out. They refuse. They remind one another not to otherize her. One of them says, "Guess she had it coming." Nobody got that coming.
Yeah.
The other one responds, "But Ella, but nothing. What's fair ain't necessarily right. You can't just up and kill your children." And when she said, "You can't just up and kill your children," it's, she didn't just do this because she's a bad, terrible throwaway person, right? There's something more. You brought that out so well. Thank you.
Right. And I think that I would also add that what Morrison does, there was something that I read. She sought out the silence. She sought out the gaps in American literature, those places where the voices, and I think each of us mentioned it in some sort of way in our talks, those who are not given the story. She sought that out, and she puts that in her novels. That's how she enters into othering. And it's only by looking at that image, acknowledging it, and not turning away from it, that you're able to see, even though it's not comfortable, because as I mentioned, it's alarming, but to see the self. In the example that you just gave, we also learned that Ella's done the same thing. So
Yeah.
she's done the same thing as Seta. So
Yeah. Any other responses to this part of our discussion? I want to widen our discussion to take in those who are with us tonight. And Josh has asked everyone to, if you have a question or a comment, to put it on the chat, and we've got a queue going. And so this is the first one, and I think it follows on what you all have been talking about. And it is, how would Morrison view binary framing, such as what we have so much today? You're either racist or anti-racist, or, and there's nothing in between. So how would she respond to that kind of binary thinking, do you think? Anyone?
I think her novels definitely respond to it already. I think she would have you look into and go into one of her novels, like Beloved, like A Paradise, because, and again, until you actually, with open arms, look at the story, because as I read before, that's how Cowan tells us we can enter into and then still be unharmed. You'd be surprised how much of looking at that other you see self. I think that's the key. It's there. It is not black or white. Let's hear from each other so that we can really see that we have more common in, as far as humanity is concerned, than different. So I think really her answer would be to give you one of her novels. There you go. Take a look. Just take a look.
That's right.
Yeah. One way, I guess, to address it, first of all, I don't want to speculate on what the deceased would actually say, because I can't, I wouldn't be able to know what Morrison. But I think one thing that hearing my fellow panelists is that, as Onyema just said, when Morrison tries to get inside the hearts and minds of even people that who seem to be the villains of the piece, and understand where they're coming from. Take school teacher as one example. School teacher is the embodiment of European, enlightenment and rationalism. To say nothing of the sort of the distance that slaveholders kept in the way they objectified, the enslaved, and saw them as chattel and dehumanized them, and of course, as Onyema said, otherized them. But why would they do that? They did that because, it was to their benefit to do that, and it required for them to train their minds to dehumanize others, to make it that much easier to enslave them. But even more benign slaveholders like Mr. Garner, who gave certain freedoms to the sweet home men, was doing so more for his own glory and self-aggrandizement than he was in any kind of beneficence. He's again a very complex character. He's still a slaveholder, and he's somebody who's relatively benign, but it's a very terrible situation to be enslaved, period. And so what Morrison does is I would say she's less inclined just to say this is racist, and to show us how one becomes racist, and how racism actually works, and how deeply it weaves itself into our souls and our minds and everything that we do. Slavery wasn't just a bunch of people deciding to be evil. It was people accepting that it was normal to otherize people. And Onyema's focus on that is exactly right. That's what Morrison wants us to understand, is how we manage to do that. And that is the real danger, is when we make people the other.
Mm-hmm. So here's a bit of a biographical or historical question for you all. To what do you attribute in particular Morrison's breaking out of her rather obscure small role in academia, and even in the publishing industry? What was it that was the occasion for her breaking out?
I think,
Yeah, Darryl,
go ahead.
and then Sanderia, go ahead.
Yeah.
I-
Well, I'd say two things: book prizes and conferences. Those are book prizes will catapult you. I mean, it's as simple as that. But also, there were scholars that started reading her work and just started teaching it and having conferences panels. That did a lot back in the late 70s and early 80s. And that got more attention as people just began to teach her. So.
Okay, Sanderia.
Similar to what Darryl said, I think I read where the Bluest Eye was out and it wasn't doing very well. And then a university, I wish I could remember the university now, selected it as its common read. And that's when it started to sell. And then it just caught fire after that. And so did her, Morrison, her name. And then in later years, it had to do with Oprah Winfrey and her book club.
Right. So here's a tough question, and I'm gonna offer the asker of this question to clarify some things if we need it. I'm not going to call a name unless he or she volunteers himself or herself. But here's the question. How can we think this story of slavery is anywhere close to being healed? And I wonder if the question really is, how can we think that slavery is anywhere near being healed when we have a story like this? Now, the asker of this question can shoot me out of the sky and tell me that I have it wrong. I guess, in other words, then, what does a story like this in Beloved do to our grappling with slavery? Onyema?
Let me just, and I'm not quite sure if I'm going to answer this according to what the writer or the questioner is looking for, but I don't think that a novel like Beloved suggests that slavery is healed. I think that it provides us a glimpse into what slavery was, what it did, its impact on America. For me personally, when I think of the novel Beloved and I think of today's society, I see in what Morrison writes where we are right now. When Morrison, for me, writes about the difference, and she illustrates the difference in memory, which I think is best illustrated through Stampede, fingering that red ribbon, being constantly reminded of the hurt and the pain, and using that in reflection to propel him forward, versus Setta's rememory that takes her right back to Sweet Home so that she never is transformed until the very end. We see the possibility. I think what Morrison does is sets up for us where we are as a society. As long as we stay in a rememory and don't truly treat slavery and talk about it and look at it and study it and teach it to students, then what we're in right now, we run into rememory. When we see a young Black man that can't take a jog in the neighborhood, that's a bump into rememory because things are not being addressed. She gives that to us in the novel Beloved, but I don't think that she in any way suggests that it's healed, but gives us an idea or a glimpse into how it can be, how we can move forward. And again, I could go back to what I mentioned with the othering. As long as we close that gate instead of an attempt to close the gap, then there is no healing. That's what she gives us.
Yeah, Amber?
Yes, thank you. Yes, and I wonder, if we might we would distinguish between the universal and the particular, and how the particular then can perhaps open up the universal. And what I mean by that is, in Beloved, I'm thinking about in the novel the parts where Seva, when she withdraws, and she's so she becomes in some ways a slave to Beloved's whims, right? And Beloved gets really plump, right? And then she becomes thin, and she neglects Denver, and she withdraws from her community. Denver, on the other hand, as she takes that risk of leaving the yard and stepping off this line, she would leave the yard, step off the edge of the world, leave the two behind, and go ask somebody for help. And that's such a key line to me in that healing process for this family. And this is the particular. Does it mean that atrocity, those horrors that have been done to them, that it's all just forgotten? Well, of course not. It's awful. But the more that Seva pushes it down, the more that she neglects Denver, the more that she stays fixated on that, the less, the more unhealthy she becomes. And so one of the things that I loved so much, I think it's such a tender part of the novel, is the community bringing them food, and how, that doesn't make slavery go away, but that is beautiful. And that is a way that this family will get, that they will rise, and they will have hope again. And so I think about all those, those people putting, their name, slips of paper, and said, who to return the dish to, and each person that is part of that healing. And it's Molly Connor wrote, the response to other is belonging, forming those bonds of community that Sanderia emphasizes.
Yeah.
Great. Yes, Darryl?
Yeah, the last 2 pages of Beloved, when Morrison would read those pages, one thing that she would do is, there's a line that's repeated in the last 2 pages: "This is not a story to pass on."
Yeah.
And the way she would read it, she would emphasize that it's supposed to be read a different way each time. This is not a story to pass on, or this is not a story to pass on, or this is not a story to pass on. And each of those those emphases means something different. It's not just a story. It's not something that you can just dream about, forget. It's not something that you can pass on, meaning you can forget it. And it's not just a story to pass on without interpretation, discussion, dealing with the trauma. Setha's scars on her back are not healed at the end of Beloved. She went through slavery, and she went through all the torments that she did. So did everybody else. And so the novel emphasizes that what's going to happen next is not that people are nobody's healed at the end, but what they've learned to do, and arguably Paul D with Setha has, what Paul D has to help Setha understand is that she is her own best thing, that she has to begin to understand herself, as opposed to letting, as Amber said, just give everything to the baby, which was self-destructive. She has to learn to love herself, but in a way that is fully developed. And that's not going to make the scars go away, but it might make them easier to bear. And that is an eternal struggle. Life is not about making all pain go away. It's about learning how to work with the pain and to move forward and find new ways of being. And that's again the hard work to do. But there is no end to it. You have to keep revising that work. And that's what Morrison keeps addressing with their characters. There's no end to their narrative. It's a narrative that continues.
So Darryl, if I could push on that just a bit, then do you think, why those 2 questions end that section, me, they don't need to be answered, I hear you saying, right? They can't be answered, maybe.
Yeah, it says when she asks those questions at the end, the way I read it is, it's almost, unfathomable to her at that moment, because this is the first time anybody has really introduced that idea to her, that you have a right to have a friend like Paul D who will help you to know your mind. And that's something that she really had not encountered. She thought that she had to give everything to her babies and everything to try to undo this past. And the thing is, she has to work on herself, and she had not ever learned how really to work on herself without all the pain and resentment that she had been, and pride that she had built up over time.
Okay. Anyone else on this point?
I also think that this is me. I also think that there are two things working here. It's the mending. I don't know how much healing it is, but it's the mending in the community, within the family. You can see those things beginning to change. But the overall, the reason why they are all there in the other, the slavery, there isn't any beginning to mend or anything in that. So I think we have two different things working here: the overall systemic racism, and then the family and community of people that set the nose.
Okay. Anything else? I want to go back to pick up something that's been our cue for a while, and it starts with you, Onyema, and then we can all jump in here. Miss Nweze, you spoke about the image and the perversion of the image. Could you speak a little bit more on this regarding what you meant? And then a confessional sentence. I lost the thread there. So can you pick up the thread and say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think what I'm mentioning or talking about in the image is, I probably didn't make it clear, but as an offshoot of the systematic racism that begins to happen as a result of slavery, one of the things that begins to happen is the idea then and the image of what being human versus more animalistic is and looks like. And so many attribute this to Willie Lynch with the separation of the darker skinned Blacks and the lighter skinned Blacks. The lighter skinned Blacks, many of them were children of the slave masters, and so were afforded the ability to be educated. And what you begin to have is this separation and this image of what it would mean to be accepted. Now, say accepted in mainstream. And so I think Morrison addresses that. First, she looks at the othering process in Beloved, but in many of her novels, she begins to go into that colorism and that separation of the deep dark brown to the more light skin. And again, that's a lot that's silenced, especially in the African-American community. We don't like to talk about that a lot. She puts it out there that it has to be addressed. And so you have those who, and it's talked about a lot in the Bluest Eye, who are more accepted by mainstream because of their look and because of their education. They have a higher social rank. But you look at a novel like Paradise, and then you have the opposite, but you're not truly Black. You're not authentic enough. You're not. And so what I'm saying is the image that is put out there as a result of systematic racism has to be really paid attention to and addressed. You can't accept it and just swallow it, but you can't ignore it. You know, and I don't want to go too much into what I'm going to be doing next week in Beloved. In the Bluest Eye. However, you know, I think the narrator of that novel, Claudia, does it very well. She looks at and notices the Shirley Temple images, the blue-eye white baby doll image, and she rejects it. She breaks that baby doll up. She wants to know, what is it about this image that is supposed to be beautiful, because I don't see it. And I think in that illustration, that's what Morrison is saying. You don't ignore it, but just taking it in as is and believing that's it, like Cola does, can be detrimental. It could be harmful. And that's what I was referring to in that distortion of image. Mainstream media, and I think that speaks to today. You know, we got the quote unquote fake news that's being talked about. You got to look at what's there, but then you don't self-hate. You don't love too much either. I think I'm mimicking what Darryl said. You don't love too much, but you have to find that balance of and appreciation for self and where you are in this.
Yes. Other notes. I'm sorry to say that we're running short on time, but I do want to bring one other thing in here. Molly, as you see, has raised the question about, raised the point of the importance of Paul D's being with Setha, and Darryl, you brought this up some in terms of telling stories and hearing stories, right? In terms of healing trauma. So I'd like to hear you all comment on that relationship between Paul D and Setha. And it goes back to, Amber, your remarks on tragedy comedy. Is one of those figures more tragic or more comic than the other? How does that interplay work, do you think, in the novel? Let's talk about Paul D a little bit. Yes, Darryl.
Well, one thing that Paul D says, before those final lines with Setha is that he thinks about how one thing that allowed him to begin to cope with his own traumas was that he met a woman who was a friend to his mind, a friend of his mind. And that's what he wanted to be to Setha. And essentially that's somebody who can really dig down deep in your mind and your soul and help you to understand all the complexities of what you've been through. I mean, effectively somebody to not just to be an ear, but somebody who really can do what he does at the end. Try to. The first lesson is you're your own best thing. And the sort of easy way to understand that, at least I think of it, is like what the instructions you get when you're on an airplane in case the oxygen drops out. Put your mask on first. Save yourself, and then you can save others. And that's what Paul D is effectively trying to teach Setha. You need to heal yourself, and then you will have something to give to the world. And she has something to give to the world, but she has to begin by working on herself. And that is one of the hardest things for all of us to do is to turn inward and really begin to work on who we are as we interact with the world.
So would you say that Paul D doesn't do too well in his first response?
That you have two legs, Setha, not four.
Yeah.
He has to undo that, and he realized that he wasn't fully comprehending what her situation was, what she had been through. And of course he didn't know what she had been through, which is that she had been objectified as an animal by a school teacher. And once he learned later more about that, that's when he could begin to really become a friend of her mind.
Other comments, remarks? Anyone?
I think I would just add the fact, I have to add in my favorite character, that a lot of Paul D's preparation and ability to come back with a better response than he had the first time is as a result of Stampede, widening his vision of what Setter did and why, that purpose. So when he goes back to 124, he's able to understand that and I think he mentioned something like, we got enough past. We need some sort of future. So it's time to move forward. But that widening of vision, that widening of understanding, to see a different image, again, I mentioned image, allows him to focus more on her 2 feet, not her 4.
Sanderia?
I know you asked about Paul D, and I agree with Darryl about the way he came back and rephrased what he had to say. But I still believe that it's the community of women that will allow Setha to see herself in them and help her to get to where she needs to be.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So to conclude, I have one final question. You know, often with a writer, a huge work overshadows the others of him or her, and we tend to put those into the shadows. And so this is a danger with Beloved of work of that stature, right? What would you recommend? Because Toni Morrison needs to be out there as much as possible. What would you recommend in terms of reading after you read Beloved, or even before you read Beloved? What are some of her novels you'd recommend? Anyone?
Jazz.
Amber?
Jazz.
Jazz? Okay.
Jazz. 100%.
It's gorgeous.
Okay.
And
Right.
I would recommend Jazz and Paradise because that then makes up the trilogy. Her trilogy was Beloved, Jazz, Paradise.
Yeah. So you go with the trilogy thinking on that, Onyema, that those three
Yes.
go together.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Any others?
I'm going to say Song of Solomon as well. Song of Solomon is an amazing work. It deserved to get the National Book Award for obvious reasons, but that's really the work that really put Morrison on the national map. But yeah, Jazz is my first recommendation to anybody who wants to read another Morrison novel.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yes, Sandra.
I would say Sula, if you want to go with friendships, learn about the past and friendships and women being friends.
Sula comes after Bluest Eye, right? And before Song of Solomon. And then Tar Baby comes in there, but it's not talked about too much, right? That novel.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Not as much.
Okay, all right, you all. Thank you. Does anyone have a last word? We could go on talking all night. Onyema, do you have a last word? You're leaning forward.
No, well, the Bluest Eye. Let's not remember. Let's not forget that next week. Anybody interested? I'm excited to be leading that.
Okay, so to do the advertisement, that's next Wednesday, right?
Next Wednesday. I think we're set up for about the same time, 6:30 to
30.
no, a little later, 6:30 to 8:30.
Yeah, 6:30 to 8:30. Yeah. But
Um,
we'll have a break in there.
yes, definitely.
So thank you all so much. This has been enlightening and a wonderful experience. So maybe we can do it again sometime. I hope so. So thank you. And we'll conclude. Josh, are you there?
Yes. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you all.